All right, AMP1 students, now that we have finished covering the structure of water, including its hydrogen bonds and the properties that are determined by those hydrogen bonds, we're going to discuss these different substances or molecules and how they react in water. So we're going to talk about 4 of them. So the 4 molecules that we're going to look at and kind of talk about how they're going to react in water. The first group of molecules are called non-electrolytes. The second group is electrolytes. And then we'll talk about nonpolar molecules. And then amphipathic molecules. Okay, so they have a nice little picture that shows these various substances. So I'm going to pull that up. Okay, so over here, we're going to start talking about these non-electrolytes. So let me describe a non-electrolyte and kind of distinguish it from an electrolyte. So when we're talking about non-electrolytes, we're talking about these molecules that they do dissolve in water, but that molecule doesn't break apart. It remains intact. And the thing with the non-electrolytes is they do not conduct electrical currents. So they're called non-electrolytes for that reason. Okay, and so that is in comparison to the electrolytes. So the electrolytes are the ones that when they also dissolve in water, but once they're in the water, they will dissociate or break apart. So they don't remain a molecule. They will actually, the atoms will separate. And the reason they're called electrolytes is because they can conduct an electrical current. And all that means is that they're free to start moving and flowing, which is what an electrical current is, the flow of ions or anything charged. So they are able to conduct an electrical current. So we call them electrolytes. Okay, so that was the definition of electrolytes and non-electrolytes. Now we'll go back to our non-electrolytes and look how they behave in water. So when they're in water, again, they're going to dissolve. So the water molecules are going to form hydrogen bonds with those molecules, and they will separate. They're just showing one glucose molecule in this water, but realize there's quite a few of them. This is just kind of a enlarged picture of the glucose with the water molecules, but the water molecules are going to form hydrogen bonds all around that glucose molecule, and they'll do the same thing around each of those glucose molecules, and they'll take those glucose molecules and separate them. So that's why we call it dissolve. They actually physically separate them from each other. But again, they remain intact. They don't break down or dissociate. So that's how glucose, which is a carbohydrate, and that's our primary sugar that's in our blood. And so that's how it would react within our blood. Okay, since our blood is a water-based liquid. Okay, so then anything that is a electrolyte, so they're using salt, specifically sodium chloride salt, as their example. So remember the sodium and chloride form a salt through the formation of an ionic bond. So whenever salt is placed into water, definitely the water molecules are going to form hydrogen bonds with those charged ions. But what they'll also do is they'll completely separate those two atoms from each other. So you'll have water forming bonds entirely around the chloride and entirely around the sodium and separate them physically. So all the sodium and chloride dissociate or break apart in that case. And because they're broken apart now, they are able to conduct an electrical current. They can start to flow and move. And so they can freely move in a solution now and carry a charge to flow. So, okay, so that is our two of our groups of molecules. So that was non-electrolytes and electrolytes, and both of them dissolve. So now we're going to move to the nonpolar molecules. And if you remember, nonpolar, just as a recap, were the molecules, nonpolar molecules are the molecules that have nonpolar covalent bonds. And so they equally share their electrons, so they're neutral, so they don't have a charge. So when it comes to nonpolar molecules, they do not dissolve within water. When you place a nonpolar molecule into water, it will stay intact, and all the components of that molecule stay intact. So they do not dissolve. And the water kind of excludes that nonpolar molecule. And again, these water molecules, remember, they have a charge on them, so they're just looking for charges to interact with, and they can't do that with a nonpolar molecule because it doesn't have a charge. So an example for the nonpolar molecules would be things like lipids, triglycerides, cholesterol. Those sort of things are considered nonpolar molecules. And you can see this, you can visualize this if you just get a glass of water and get some oil, maybe some olive oil or corn oil, and just drop some drops into the cup of water, and you'll see that it doesn't dissolve, it doesn't mix, break down or anything. It just kind of stays intact and doesn't break down within the water. So another term that we'll use to describe nonpolar molecules, because they seem to not like water, we'll use that term hydrophobic. Hydro means water, phobic means phobia. So nonpolar molecules will also use that term hydrophobic to explain them. And then these electrolytes and non-electrolytes over here, since they dissolve in water and even the electrolytes dissociate or break down, they call them hydrophilic. So hydro meaning water, philic meaning loving. So they kind of love water. And then the nonpolar ones kind of are scared of water, fear it. So they don't associate with it. Kind of just exclude themselves from it. All right, so that was our nonpolar molecules. So we talked about non-electrolytes, electrolytes, and how they behave in water, and then the nonpolar molecules and how they behave. So the last one is kind of a weird one, I would say, because it's a molecule that they call it amphipathic molecules, and that's because part of the molecule is polar and then part is nonpolar. So the polar part likes the water, and water will react with it, but the nonpolar doesn't, and it won't react with water. So to give you an example of an amphipathic molecule, so they say it partially dissolves because part of it does and part of it doesn't. So, but to give you an example, every cell in our body has something called a cell or a plasma membrane, and it's made up of these little structures, substances called phospholipids. So that means there's a phosphate component to it and a lipid component to it. And because it has the lipid component, remember we said lipids are nonpolar, that's the nonpolar part, and they're the little tails here. So they will be, in our cell or plasma membrane, they'll be pointing towards the inside of the plasma or cell membrane. So this entire structure here is a cell or plasma membrane. So that's kind of a magnified look at the wall of a cell. And it's called a cell or plasma membrane. So all the little lipids they are nonpolar and they don't like water, they're facing the inside of that cell or plasma membrane. And then you can see on the outside of the cell and then inside the cell there's water. So the little phosphate heads here, those are polar, and so they They're hydrophilic. They don't mind the water, so they're facing the water surface here. So that's amphipathic molecules. Those are ones that have part hydrophilic or polar and then part hydrophobic or nonpolar. So, and there's another example too, but I'm just going to stick with the phospholipid example. Okay, so let me go to our objectives. So we compared substances that dissolve in water with those that both dissolve and dissociate. So that was the ones that dissolve in water and don't dissociate, or they remain intact, are the non-electrolytes, and the ones that dissolve and dissociate are the electrolytes. And then we distinguish between electrolytes and non-electrolytes, and those are, the main difference is the ability to carry or conduct an electrical current. So electrolytes can, because they can freely move, because they dissociate, and then non-electrolytes cannot. And then how nonpolar substances like lipids react in water. They pretty much don't react with it, and they will kind of separate themselves from it. And then the amphipathic molecules, how they interact in water. And they're there to form a barrier. So the cell membrane or plasma membrane example that we used, that's the barrier between the inside of the cell and the outside of the cell. Okay, so that ends this video, and on the next video we'll start talking about acids and bases. I'll see you in the next video.